All right, thank you for taking a few minutes. I mentioned in my recap from last month that I was going to release a special update on the debt ceiling. Doing that today. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get into it. What we're going to be talking about is what is the debt ceiling? How are we unique, the USA specifically? Because we are very, very unique when it comes to debt ceilings. A little bit of a history lesson about some kind of interesting components for me, and then what is at stake here. And there's a lot at stake. You could argue that there's more at stake now than literally any time when we've had this debt ceiling debate. So lots to cover. Let's get into it. Let's start with what is the debt ceiling. So the debt ceiling is a self-imposed, underline that word, self-imposed limit on how much a government can borrow to pay its debts. It's not a limit on spending. Not technically. It's only a limit on borrowing. However, a government cannot spend without borrowing the money. Now, the first reasonable question would be, why is that the case? Why does the government have to borrow money? Well, think about home loans. I'm a lender. I'm a mortgage lender. That's my specialty. Most people cannot buy a house without borrowing, right? Most people just do not have the capital on hand to be able to pay cash for that house. And when we look at a government or a country as a whole, it's a gigantic house. It's the biggest house you can have. So there's just no way for the government to operate without borrowing money. And the government is constantly raising funds. They're typically raising funds by way of T-bills, treasury bills. They will have a fixed term, 10-year treasury. They will say, hey, consumers, governments, anybody who wants a very safe investment, come give us your money and we will pay you money back with interest. It is a bond. It is a fixed interest rate, fixed term. It is a bond. So the government releases T-bills. They then ask for money from people. They pay them back money with interest. It's a very safe investment traditionally, historically. We're going to talk about a little bit about how the government's credit rating was downgraded in 2011, which has some pretty wide-ranging effects with everything. But the government's constantly raising money to pay their bills. Pension, Social Security, utilities, infrastructure. They have to borrow money to raise capital to do all of that. Once the limit is reached, the Treasury can enact extraordinary measures. And you're going to hear a lot about extraordinary measures. They can enact extraordinary measures to delay default. We actually technically hit our borrowing limit back on January 19th. The government then said, hey, look, we're enacting these extraordinary measures. And those extraordinary measures are typically delaying payments into retirement accounts, borrowing money, moving money around between different departments of the government. Those are all extraordinary measures. They're estimating, and estimating is another key word here. They're estimating that we will default around June 1st. So we've got less than a month now before this is going to go into effect. It would not be the first time it's happened. It's actually happened 4 other times, but as you're going to see in a little bit, those were all very, very weird circumstances as well. So that's what the debt ceiling is. It is a borrowing limit. It is self-inflicted. And by that, I mean, we're very unique. The US is very, very unique. Most countries have a set borrowing limit, a set debt ceiling or debt limit. They're all synonyms, tied to the GDP. How much is your country producing? How much goods are they producing in a given year? It's kind of like, again, mortgages. When we qualify for a mortgage, we look at your debt to income ratio. How much money do you make? We can lend you a limit based on that. We can use that debt to income ratio to determine how much you can borrow from a lender, right? Same thing with the government. Most governments say, hey, look, we're going to use our GDP as a basis for our borrowing limit. Some countries don't have a borrowing limit at all. Some countries don't have a debt ceiling at all. How is that possible? Well, they go at it with the approach of, if we pass a budget, we darn sure better make sure you can borrow money against it. If we're going to say, hey, look, you can buy this much of a house, we need to determine how much you can borrow to do so. So the two tend to go lockstep. They tend to go hand in hand with one another. The US is one of many countries that do have a separate debt ceiling. Most have that debt ceiling tied to their GDP, how much they're actually producing. It's only 2 countries that have a separate limit. That is the USA and Denmark. Those are the only 2 countries where they have a separate limit, what they call an absolute amount, which is a separately negotiated amount. That one key detail is critically important, because if you have an absolute limit and you don't have a limit based on a percentage of GDP, it becomes a political tool. It becomes a piece of leverage that parties can try to get something out of the other for. If it was just a percentage of GDP, there's no negotiating. There's no conversation. It's just a percentage of GDP. Have a great day. We're off and rolling. That's why most countries do it that way. The US is very unique in that aspect. It is a political tool. Trying desperately hard not to discuss politics here, which when it comes to the debt ceiling is incredibly hard. I'm trying to thread that needle. Hopefully I do an okay job. There's also an argument, and this is also unique to the US, that the debt ceiling should not exist at all with the US. And you're going to hear Amendment 14 being cited quite a bit, especially in the next couple weeks. So Amendment 14 says, abbreviated version here, but the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. Kind of straightforward there, but it's shall not be questioned that raises a lot of questions. It's been raised many times before of, hey, look, it seems like we shouldn't be able to default on our debt because it shall not be questioned. But every single time a president has looked to use this amendment, they've come back with the conclusion of, we're really not sure that it's going to hold up in courts. We're really not sure if it's going to get held up when this eventually gets to the Supreme Court, whether or not that truly is or is not the case. So maybe it kicks the can down the road a little bit further. Maybe it staves off default by a little bit, but eventually it's going to end up in the courts. It's going to end up in the Supreme Court. And if it does, it may not go the way the current administration wants it to because of the current makeup of the Supreme Court as well. So very, very kind of interesting pieces. You're going to hear a lot about Amendment 14. Amendment 14 specifically states that the validity of the public debt shall not be questioned. As short and sweet as that. They're also not sure that it's going to hold up in courts, especially the higher courts. So that's how we are unique. A little bit of a history lesson here. So the debt limit has been politicized. It has become a political tool since the 1950s. President Eisenhower was in the presidency. That's the first time this really came about. Since 1960, the debt ceiling has actually been raised 78 times. So it's very common for it to be raised. It started really becoming a political issue in 2011. And 2011 was by far and away the worst fight that occurred. You may or may not remember that. But ultimately, it came down to the 11th hour. We very narrowly escaped going into default on our debt. And the Democrats ended up giving up a lot of concessions to make it happen. You could argue a couple different things here. And again, I'm trying to be as apolitical as possible here. But you could argue a couple different things here. One, if the Democrats had dug in their feet and just let it go into default, it would have caused a lot of issues. So they kind of had to bend to the will. But you could also argue that since they did bend to their will, it now sets up a stage where every 2 years we're going through the exact same thing. It's between a rock and a hard spot. You either default and cause a global financial crisis. God, nobody wants that, right? Or you bend to their will, give them their concessions, stave off default, but now you set up a stage where they realize, and not just they, but every party realizes, hey, look, this is the most leverage you can ever possibly have. Leverage is all about consequences, and the consequences of a default are severe. So you can really use this issue to kind of get what you want. And the Democrats bended, they conceded, they staved off default. It did ultimately end up leading to a downgrading in our credit rating. Our credit rating was AAA, now it's AA+. We didn't default. We just got so close to it that the entities are like, yeah, no, we don't feel as comfortable as we did prior to. It ended up costing the U.S. a couple $1 billion because now all of a sudden it was more expensive to raise capital if you're the U.S. Just as somebody with a perfect credit score of 780 gets better rates, so does somebody with a AAA rating versus AA+ rating when it comes to governments. Since then, it's been a recurring issue. It's popping up consistently every 2 years. Now, you may be a little bit confused as to what was going on because on April 30th, you heard that the House passed a bill to raise the ceiling. Woohoo! That all sounds great. However, that was literally only the House of Representatives, and it was pretty much down party lines. It's going to be dead on arrival when it arrives in the Senate. And it's become not just a political issue between Republicans and Democrats, but within each party as well. If you recall, Kevin McCarthy, the U.S. House of Representatives, House Majority, it took him 15 votes to get confirmed. It took 15 votes for him to get confirmed, which means there's a lot of negotiating within his own party. Well, that's occurred as well. Just to get to that, hey, the House passed a bill to raise the ceiling, even that took a lot of negotiating. So not only do we have political parties negotiating and trying to use leverage with one another, but now within their own party, they're creating additional pieces to the puzzle as well, which is creating a lot of issues. That's why there's so much concern about this one in particular, because not only is each party very divided, but within each party, it's very divided. That's an issue. So what's at stake here? Government shutdown. It would not be the first time the government's shut down. The government's actually shut down, I think it's 21 times overall. You remember some, during the Trump's administration, there was government shutdowns, the longest one I think we've ever had, actually. That was because they could not come to terms with the budget. So they don't come to terms with the budget, government shutdown. If they default on debt, it'll inevitably lead to a government shutdown, which, if you recall, it means museums are closed, it means parks are closed, it means a lot of services are delayed as well. They did everything they possibly could to avoid reduction in services like Social Security, which people, if you're receiving Social Security, you're on fixed income. You might not have a lot of room to breathe. It would surely lead to a reduction in our credit rating. Just the threat of a default led to a reduction in our credit rating, which is going to cost more in the future. So you can really hurt people today and hurt them even more tomorrow, because all of a sudden, when the U.S. wants to raise money by selling the treasuries, they have to do so at a higher interest rate. That means it's costing the government more money to raise money. It can cause a cascading effect. It would lead to potentially a global financial crisis. If you recall, there's been other countries as well that have had to default on debt. And when they have, it's created a lot of issues. And those were significantly smaller countries. It was not the USA. And the USA, the US dollar, is still the reserve currency for much of the world. So it would create a lot of issues. It would weaken our dollar overall. So everything would get more expensive. You want to talk about inflationary? Yeah. Well, when your dollar is weakened, it's going to definitely be inflationary. So we've been fighting very hard to keep inflation down. If we have a weakened dollar, it's going to cause inflation to creep back up. That's going to be very negative for the U.S. Decrease in services, I mentioned that already, but decrease in healthcare, education, Social Security, it can affect all of those. It could also strengthen arguments to have a non-U.S. based world currency. The U.S. dollar is still king. If the U.S. defaults on their debt, you could have a very strong argument on hand that should no longer be the case. The only reason the U.S. is the reserve currency for much of the world is because we are so stable. We do have that great credit rating. If you degrade all of that and weaken the dollar, it's going to strengthen the arguments to get away from the U.S. dollar. So that would be very negative, obviously. It could shift worldwide allegiances because of that as well. People will say, hey, look, the U.S. is no longer as stable as it once was. We probably should be looking at alternatives. And lastly, what's at stake? Honestly, we don't really know. So there's been 4 other defaults in the U.S. history. 1862, that was a result of the Civil War and not being able to pay some debts. The defaults in 33, 68, and 71, those all had to do with silver or gold being converted into U.S. dollars and the U.S. saying, hey, we're getting away from this practice. So those were very somewhat intentional defaults. They were not anything like what we've seen or what we could possibly see in the future. So a lot has changed since then. Honestly, we don't really know what the outcome would be, but I can guarantee you it would not be good. So there's a lot at stake here. And due to the gigantic divisions within parties and amongst the parties, there's a lot to be concerned about. The Republicans, who currently hold a majority in the House, they saw what they could do in 2011. We wanted to pass all these things with Barack Obama's administration. We held this critical, severe implications of a default. We basically held them at gunpoint, and they bent to our will. If they bent to our will in the past, how do we know that they're not going to in the future as well? We could really ask for whatever we kind of want. And the U.S. has to face the consequences of either default, which, as you can see here, is not good. It has a lot of really dire effects. Or they're going to bend to our will and we're going to get exactly what we want. Or the U.S. is going to have to do something that they've never done before, which is lean on Amendment 14. So there's a lot of different ways that this could go. I hope that cooler heads prevail, but there's a lot of concern right now. I don't think being hyperbolic when we say this is probably the most severe possibility since 2011. And 2011, stocks were hurt when the credit was downgraded. Treasuries were worsened because of the downgrade. So even getting close to a default could have some negative consequences. So long as we don't actually go into default, those consequences can be somewhat muted. A couple $2 billion is what it cost the U.S. extra because they're still the best game in town at the time. Is not a big piece of the puzzle. It's a kind of small drop in the bucket. But if we do default, significant consequences. So hoping the cooler heads prevail. You're going to hear a lot about this. Hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more about what is the debt ceiling, kind of what is at stake, and why are we even having these conversations, and how is the U.S. unique as a whole. So I hope that helps. If you have any other questions for me, please let me know. Say it all the time. I'm a nerd for this kind of stuff. It's a weird thing to be passionate about, but I am. So thank you all so much. Appreciate you all. And thank you for the continued referrals. It is the lifeblood of our business, and we never take it for granted. Truly, truly never take it for granted. So I appreciate you all. Thank you. Bye.